You're listening to the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast with your host, Bill Clanton.
Welcome to episode number 4 of the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast. I'm Bill Clanton, and this is the podcast where we are documenting my transition from being an employee for many years to now being an entrepreneur. And I want to say hi to those that are finally joining us on video. Hi to all our video viewers. And if you're not seeing this and you're hearing it as a podcast, well, hello to our audio listeners as well, as this podcast starts to grow in popularity and technical capabilities. So to recap where we've been over the past few weeks here, we've been talking about my transition from employee to entrepreneur. And I want to reiterate, I'm not necessarily giving this as a blueprint for what you should do. It's what I did. And if you want to copy what I did, by all means, feel empowered, because I was able to make a successful transition from being an employee to now being an entrepreneur. I have several businesses. A couple of people have asked me on Instagram, what is it that you do? Well, I have a small coloring book empire where I've started making adult coloring books. About 2 years ago, I started working on that, right about when the boom happened. And so I have those. You can find those on my website, billclantonbooks.com. Also, I own a radio station. Gee, there's an interesting transition for an entrepreneur. I do own a radio station. I'm a CEO and president of WBNJ in Barnegat, so that keeps me busy. Also, I am an author, and I'm currently working on the book, Employee to Entrepreneur. About 5 days that changed my life. And if you've been listening to the podcast up to this point, you know what those 5 days were. That was the vacation I took where I pretended for 5 days that I did not have a job to go back to after the vacation was complete. And then I have other endeavors that I work on with my wife and her business. So we're an entrepreneurial family. You could say. Even my son is at that point where he's starting to build his own little empire of sorts. And we'll cover that in future podcasts when we talk about maybe encouraging our kids to follow in our footsteps. So moving along with the journey from employee to entrepreneur that we've been discussing here for the past few weeks is I left the job. I had the 5 days where I pretended that I was on vacation. And remember in the last episode, we talked about me hiring my replacement and how that kind of had a little bit of awkwardness to it. But in the end, it worked out good for me to hire somebody that I felt comfortable walking away from the job. Because again, I wanted to leave on good terms. That was my thing. So I worked part-time. And the previous job, I worked in radio. So, gee, what do you think? I own a radio station. I used to work in radio. It kind of goes hand in hand. But so I hired my replacement, and then I worked part-time up until November 1st of 2013. And it was only recently that I decided to start documenting this transition of how I was able to make it happen. And over the past 4 years, and I look back, I would not give up my lifestyle for anything. I don't see me ever going back to being an employee. It's just, you know what? Entrepreneurship is too much fun. As long as you're willing to put in the work, and the work is important. And that's where on this week's show, I want to talk about the dreaded comfort zone. And for many years, I wanted to get out and start my own business. I wanted to even when I had a radio station already on the air, I still felt like I had to have that 9-to-5 job as a cushion when the business was not necessarily making enough to sustain me and my family. So I still put a higher priority on the 9-to-5 instead of, maybe in some cases I could have been out of the job a lot sooner had I focused more on the side hustle, which was actually quite a big side hustle. But instead, I focused on the job. You want to know why? Because I was comfortable. Because I was working a 40-hour-a-week job that was actually more of a 80-hour-a-week job. But the point was, I had that set salary coming in every 2 weeks. I had a check coming in, and I didn't have to worry too much. If I showed up for work, did what I had to do, went home at the end of the day, I knew that the paycheck would show up in my bank account automatically. It was comfort. The comfort zone was my worst enemy because I didn't have to work as hard. So I hope that this doesn't scare anyone who may have been considering entrepreneurship as their future. If you felt as though you were going, you wanted to venture out, it does take some work. There's no such thing as having that hustle and that success without putting in some form of work into what you're doing. So if you are not comfortable with doing that work, maybe entrepreneurship's not made for you. Maybe just getting a job that you love to do and doing your, making your 40, 50, 60, 70,000 a year. And you know what? That's fine for you. I'm not here to tell you that you need to make more or do more. It's just that if your intention is to become an entrepreneur, well, then you do indeed need to get out of your comfort zone and do some things that maybe you normally wouldn't do, especially if it means networking and talking to people and making leads and getting, talking to people. Communication is probably going to be the most important skill that you're going to need as you become an entrepreneur. And if you don't have great communication, and I'm not saying good communication. I mean, you have to have great communication skills and be able to present yourself and speak clearly and be able to give that elevator pitch. Hey, what do you do? Oh, well, I'm an entrepreneur. Oh, really? What do you do? And you've got to be able to give them the 20-second spiel, or at least a spiel that makes them enticed to want to know more about you. And, I sometimes say, people say, well, what do you do? Well, I talk to 30,000 people on a daily basis. And then that really gets them thinking. Of course, I'm talking about being on the radio. I am also a radio personality. So I do get that opportunity to speak to a lot of people. And not only that, they're like, wait, I'll meet people. And a lot of times that's usually the opening line for me. Wait, your voice sounds familiar. I've heard you somewhere before. And that usually sets it off. But we're getting onto a tangent here. The point is that I had to get out of my comfort zone. And with that also, you have to grow a backbone and a thick skin, because guess what? Everyone is not going to like everything you do. I can tell you a story. I'm not going to get into names or anything like that, but shortly after the launch of my company, we were only a month into launching WWN Interactive, and we took on a project that was a little difficult. Now, I say we because I did have a partner. My partner, Tara, worked with me. She did graphic design work, and it was nice to have that offset of having somebody working with me to do the graphic work and some of the web design work that we were doing. Because in addition to having the radio station, I also started an interactive firm doing websites. So one of the big mistakes I made was taking on a project that was beyond the scope of our abilities. And I hustled. I worked hard at trying to bring that project together and make it happen. And in the end, we did, but we totally did not meet any of the deadlines that were set. It was a disaster, and it did not end well, and needless to say, that person is no longer a client of ours, and it was one of those stumbling blocks that I had to learn a lot from. And one of those is knowing that you need to have a thick skin. When a person is getting in your face, it takes emotional intelligence to back down, and also, you have to have a thick skin and be able to just let it roll off, because most of the time their anger is bringing out things that they don't really mean, and being able to handle a client in that situation. Now, the smart thing that I did was not blasting back at this client, and it could have gotten a lot worse. But the end result was that we learned a big lesson, and that was when to say no. You can't just take on every job just because you need the money. You've got to be able to say no and line up those jobs that you know that you're going to be able to do outside of your comfort zone, but also know your abilities, self-awareness. You've got to know what you can do. And I knew that I could do certain things, but I can't do everything. And that is probably the biggest lesson that I learned in this particular scenario, was that I have to learn to be able to say no. That's going to wrap things up for this edition of the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast. And we continue this story as we talk about my transition from being an employee to now being an entrepreneur. And, I will share with you the good times and the bad times that have come along with that. So remember to follow me on Instagram. Search for Bill Clanton Biz. That's B-I-Z. Find me on Twitter, Bill Clanton Biz. On Facebook, find my company, WWN Interactive. Also, find me on YouTube. You can now subscribe to the videos of this. If you're listening to the audio format right now, hey, pop over to YouTube, and you can now subscribe to the video of the podcast as well. Just search for Bill Clanton, B-I-Z. And I look forward to talking to you and answering some questions. Feel free to send me questions. If you're in this boat too, and you are transitioning from employee to entrepreneur, or maybe you are an employee right now and you want to transition, but maybe you're either afraid, apprehensive, and you just have some questions for me on how I dealt with certain issues, by all means, shoot me a question in the comments. Or you can hit me up on Instagram, DM me, look for me on Twitter, all those wonderful things, and we'll talk again soon.
This has been the Employee to Entrepreneur podcast, a production of WWN Interactive.